Well, hi, everyone. We have spoken a lot about AI over the past couple of days. We're all being asked to personalize better experiences, scale faster, be more efficient with our data. But one of the things I'm hearing from customers right now is that you're looking at measuring these types of things, that's not necessarily become simpler in the last couple of years. Tracking has changed, consent expectations have tightened, signal loss, well, that's real. But the pressure to actually prove the performance of these types of personalizations, that's not gone anywhere. So organizations are often being asked to accelerate on a foundation that often seems less certain than it used to be. And that's why I love the Selfridges story, because it's not about chasing anything new. It's about restoring the trust and clarity in a world that's just generally become noisier. So Hannah, before we start, would you mind introducing yourself and your role at Selfridges?
Yes, of course. So my name's Hannah Severin. I'm the Senior Analytics Manager at Selfridges, looking after data, implementation and insight.
So take us back to that moment when you realized something had shifted, when you realized the business was losing faith or had lost faith in your data.
Yeah, of course. So post the GA4 migration, it was a murky time. There were lots of uncertainties. And I recall sitting in meetings and listening, and the references to data were just declining. So people would talk to revenue, they'd talk to sales, but there was nothing about the funnel. There were no micro conversions, there were no demand indicators, there was no reference to traffic. And it just made me realize that actually the business were withdrawing from data. And it felt like that lack of trust was them supplementing with other data sources, which are perfectly valid, anecdotal data, qualitative feedback. But there's still a place for quantitative data and numbers and understanding the customer journey. And that was where I decided to start.
So when you looked at resetting this foundation, how do you actually decide where to start there?
So I treated it like a discovery. So really talking to my stakeholders, understanding where their gaps were, what questions were they having that they didn't feel they could answer. And it wasn't that the numbers weren't there, it was just a lack of understanding and why there were differences to what they'd seen previously.
And what do you think the catalyst of these uncertainties came from?
I think it's a lack of clarity. I think after a change, there's normally, in a good change rollout, there's updates, there's real transparency on the metrics, on the successes. But actually, with the GA4 migration, there was still a few bugs. And I think because there wasn't necessarily clarity in the deliverables, it meant that users weren't sure what they were seeing.
Okay. So what did you actually change, in the process?
So we had migrated, but we also had another migration, which was our front end platform. So during that, the opportunity came up for us to actually look at our consent. And that's where I thought, actually, this would be a great place to start. It's the beginning of the journey and it's the beginning of the data. So starting there and talking to our stakeholders, leaning in with DPO, legal, and making sure they all understood what our privacy stance was and what data we were collecting felt like a really good place to start the journey.
And could you maybe walk the audience through kind of what your original consent framework looked like and how that evolved and maybe solved some of the inconsistencies you were saying?
Yes, of course. So we have been with Tealium for over 5 years. And during our previous consent implementation, we'd had to develop a hybrid implementation to answer the business questions. So the question the business really wanted to understand was, what is the drop-off that we're seeing between users seeing the UI and then actually signaling their consent? And that wasn't available at the time. So we had to have a hybrid solution which combined our native front end of the website and then Tealium was our CMP behind that. It worked, it answered the questions, but it wasn't necessarily the easiest implementation. It meant that there was a gap between the two platforms, and that meant that there could also be some ambiguity in the data that we were seeing.
And then what did you move to?
So when we went on this discovery, One of the things I came across was content orchestrations actually here last year. And that allowed us to, instead of having a hybrid solution, actually have everything contained within one platform. So no longer need for a native hybrid combination. Actually, what we could have is everything housed within Tealium, the banner, the front end, and the CMP all within the one solution.
But am I right in saying it wasn't all plain sailing? Because when you went into production, you had a significant drop in traffic that you saw. Could you walk us through that moment?
Yeah. So I can tell you exactly where I was. I was driving. It was a Friday. No one releases on a Friday. And I could see the Teams messages coming through. And if you get that many messages in a minute, you know it's just not good. And I remember pulling up and being like, oh my gosh, what has happened? And it was looking at trying to read as the messages were still coming through and seeing the decline in traffic, the questions on whether we roll back, but do we do that on a Friday? Is anyone around on a Saturday to monitor? We did hold our nerve. We didn't roll back. And on Monday, there was a very extensive deep dive, which always goes back to the data and an Excel spreadsheet to understand where this drop was coming from, and what was driving it. And actually, what it turns out for us was that this was bot traffic. We had a significant bot problem, which we'd always known about. But I think one of the selling points in GA4 in terms of the migration was that we were going to have better visibility of the bot volume of traffic that was coming through. But we were still seeing quite large quantities coming through, even past the engaged sessions benchmark of the funnel. And when we released and we migrated to content orchestration, so we actually were able to, well, I wouldn't say to personally eradicate, but we were able to see that traffic disappear and get more clarity over our conversion numbers, our traffic, and our demand.
So you didn't lose customers, you lost noise.
Yes.
Just as well. And then came another test, which was the ICO audit. This is the ultimate test on whether you understand your data. Could you talk us through that process?
Yes, of course. So with the ICO audit, it really is the acid test, not in what I know about our consent and how we're managing it, but actually how I've communicated that to our key stakeholders. Our exec are the people who have to put their names to that audit. They need to sign. So those signatories need to be confident in what we've done. But going through this process, going through consent orchestrations means that actually our ICO team and our legal team were really comfortable with our stance on privacy. And that meant that in the rooms that I wasn't in, where they were having meetings with the exec, they could convey that level of confidence. And I think that's what made the difference in something that could have taken 6 to 8 weeks to being quite a smooth process. And I think that really made the difference for us.
Yeah. I think you mentioned earlier that it went from 6 to 8 weeks to around 2 weeks. So that's quite a considerable time saving for the business.
Definitely.
So now you've got this trust back in your data. What has this unlocked for you at Selfridges? Like what's next?
So Selfridges is a brand with lots of ambition. It's a heritage brand. It has a store which has a huge presence. For a digital business alongside that, we really want to look to see how we can echo and deliver that experience online. So a combination of looking at how we can leverage our in-store data, looking at Offline CAPI, also then looking at the ever-looming personalization experience and how we can make that more relevant for our customers will always be central, I think, to our upcoming roadmap.
Yeah. So listening to that, I'm going to pull out 3 key things for the room. When trust drops, speed drops, but probably also accuracy drops. To be honest, if you're sat in a meeting room making finger in the air suggestions around customer data. But secondly, consent and signal quality, they're not just compliance topics. They're really about having the confidence in the data that you're making decisions on. And third, if you want to scale, have smarter activation, automation, or even AI, the foundation underneath, it has to be clean, governed, and most importantly, defensible. Hannah, if there's one piece of advice you would give to the room right now, what would that be?
I'd say in terms of where we are with all the technology advancements, if you want to go anywhere fast, you have to kick your tires. And I think consent is one of those big tires. You need to be able to know that you can trust your data. And more importantly, your stakeholders need to trust your data. It's not just about what you know about your implementation, but it's how much confidence do your DPO, your legal, and your exec have in your stance and making sure that you're enforcing that. And I think that's what enables you to leverage the opportunities, and be first to market, be bold in the decisions, because you have trust, and more importantly, they have trust.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was fantastic. Hannah's going to be here for the rest of the events. If anybody wants to deep dive into the Selfridges story, I'm sure she'll be happy to talk you through that. We've also got Caleb, our head of product for consent orchestration at the Genius Bar. So if you want to understand more about Tealium's consent offerings, I'd encourage you to go and talk to him. So thank you very much.
Thank you.